Ready? Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Henry George School of Social Science. This is class number 2, called Wages, Capital, Maintenance of Labor. This is the second class of 6 in the fall of 2018 on the book Progress and Poverty that Henry George wrote during the 1870s and finished it in the 1879. So what I was going to do today is continue on book number 1. And if people are unfamiliar with Progress and Poverty, Henry George wrote a book called Progress and Poverty. And then within that book are 10 books that comprise the entire material. Within each of those 10 books are several chapters. And we've divided up the classes so that the material in each class is between 30 and 60 pages, so it's not a big thing to read. And before we go into the material, I just wanted to let everybody know that we're going to skip we're going to skip October 3rd and resume class 3 on October 10th. So we're not going to meet next week to give you more time to read. And the other thing that might happen is Steve Sklar, who's an instructor within the school, he has agreed, he hasn't confirmed, but it's real likely that he's going to teach book 2, which is about population and Malthus, and we're going to be disproving the Malthusian theory on population. So let me go to the first slide. I'm repeating some of the first slide just so that you can put yourself in the mindset of how I think this course should be taught. I think it's important to realize you've got the title of the book, Progress and Poverty, then you've got the subtitle, An Inquiry into the Cause of Industrial Depressions and the Increase of Want with Increase of Wealth, the Remedy. So he's saying that this book that we're covering from beginning to end is the remedy, and it's been available for 140 years, incompletely utilized, but where it is utilized, there's a lot of benefit. But I just want to repeat that every time, just so that we understand where he was going with it. I think it's also important to realize that this book came out in 1879. There was a crisis in 1873, which was the first international financial crisis that was based in Central Europe. It was exacerbated by a collapse of the Northern Pacific Railroad construction that would be going from Duluth to California. And it just shows that speculation without sufficient returns can't keep the bubble growing, and that's what happened. So the atmosphere was ripe to hear Henry George and his book on Progress and Poverty. He's not writing a textbook. What he's trying to do is attempt to discover the laws which control a great social concern, great social problem. So in the first class and in this class, you'll see how he goes over and over. You would think, yeah, I understand it, but then he goes and provides 10 more examples, just so that you don't miss the fine points of what he's trying to get at. Because what he's trying to do is create a science of political economy with very exact word definitions like capital and labor and wages and where all these come from. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize before we go into the material is that George speaks from a community perspective. And when you see page numbers and this is slide number 6. A community perspective regarding capital and wealth, where he says increases in land values are not increases in community wealth, unless you have a single tax program where we're collecting the increased land value. So there are people who support George from a libertarian point of view. I think it's important to understand what George actually wrote, because he's talking from a community perspective. And this is something that I wrote. Stopping inequality does not make wealth equally distributed, just that there's a better chance that it could be. And this is maybe the socialism of Henry George. There's there's debate on whether he's a socialist or not. It's pretty clear that he wasn't a socialist, and I think this statement here kind of puts it in perspective. He's for stopping inequality. Okay, now you guys, why don't you get your act together and make sure that wealth is equally distributed. He doesn't have a grand plan for dividing wealth, let's say. There's concern for aggregate wealth, not individual wealth. And then he says several times in the book, there may be relative wealth in a community, say in a casino where somebody wins, somebody doesn't win, yet with a few drops of ink, this wealth could be utterly annihilated. So he's talking about real wealth, real production, real trade, and that's important to realize. This is something that I was planning on wearing my t-shirt. Henry George makes socialism superfluous, if you understand where he's coming from. Is that if you had a Henry George solution, there would be no need for socialism because we're distributing wealth equally. And then the last is a little joke about please read your assignments, because when Henry George says, he talks about desires being satisfied with the least exertion, he's not talking about skipping out on reading the assignments. So, I added this slide from last time because this is the book that you need to get, and if you go on the slides and you click on this link, the book was written in 1916, excellent insights on the origin, challenges, and fate of the single tax movement. I reference this book in the book, and I guess we do have some readings. After the last class, there was a concern that we weren't reading from the book. So if you excuse me for a second, I'm going to get some of the readings. And I guess I'll have volunteers as we come up. One of the things that came up after the last class, the first class, was people wanting to read from the book. So I printed out the readings that I think are appropriate. So what we're going to be doing today is talk about Book 1, Chapter 3, 4, and 5. We covered chapters 1 and 2 last week. And if you want to see the whole presentation and the question and answers, they're posted on the website, www.hgsss.org. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the class 3, and just want to remind you that our next class is on October 10th. So this is a little overview. I don't want to spend a lot of time because we got a lot of material. You can get these slides on the website. How to distribute produced wealth. Wages from labor, interest to the capitalist, rent for social adjustments. And social adjustments is the phrase that Henry George uses over and over. And he's talking about when things aren't quite going right, like there's too many crimes being committed, maybe we need more police, or maybe we need smarter enforcement or something. Roads, bridges, communication, all these infrastructure things. And very simply, agricultural production, you can see labor and land being combined to produce something, And the typical way is part of the produce goes to the landowner, part of the produce goes to the labor, kind of a simple example. When we get more capital, it gets a little bit more complex, but you see where the rent is going to the landowner. This is the typical way that things are done. You see replaced consumed capital there, and what Henry George calls the true wages fund. All these items on this diagram are explained, and I'll get into that. And this is expanding it just a little bit, just to explain what production is. Henry George goes into a lot of detail that production is adapting, which includes manufacturing and transporting, also growing as an agricultural, and exchanging. So if you go to page 186, you'll see that definition. This is in a nutshell, this is the Henry George theorem, if you understand this diagram. Because what I've done is show where option 1 goes to the landowner, the rent, but Henry George is advocating that option 2, which is infrastructure services. And if you go to social problems, you'll see these 20 examples of infrastructure that are considered social adjustments. And if you go to the website and you see all these page numbers, just go to those page numbers. I'm not making this up. This is Henry George talking. He describes what interest is, what rent is, production, true wages fund, and a very good summary of infrastructure. And the main thing that I'm going to be talking about is the idea that that excess economic returns need to come to us, the community, in the way of services. I also call a common pool collective, which you can, if you want to search for the presentation I made in Baltimore on August 29th, that'll go and make a little bit more sense about the common pool. So here we go into the next 3 chapters, the last chapters of book 1. Wages produced by the labor. So I'm going to go through these slides. There are going to be some readings, and anybody who wants to volunteer for the reading, just either come up here or get your book open. I don't see anybody with the book open, so what we'll do is pass these out when the time comes. So the entire chapter is about prominent, and this is a term that I made up, intellectual gutter talk. I wanted to use something that's grabbing, because Henry George is very vociferous about these lies that are accepted as fact in the 19th century about the origin of wages. So what he does in this chapter is points out the intellectual gutter talk and then corrects it. For example, the shoemaker makes shoes. The shoes are his wages. Capital is not lessened. In this example, with new shoes, he has a capital, which is shoes, plus a difference in the value between the materials and the shoes. This additional value is his wages. There's no capital being advanced by a capitalist on a high chair in the big office someplace. So he says, and he's critical of Adam Smith in this point, had Adam Smith kept with his original statements about produce of labor being the natural recompense or the wages of labor, political economy of 1879 would not embrace such a mass of contradictions and absurdities, such as what Adam Smith said later. In every part of Europe, 20 workmen serve under a master for one that is independent, providing his capital and wages to the workmen. So at page 51. This is slide 20 for people that are watching online or watching the archive. So the error that wages are drawn from capital in 1879, he calls it a universal truth upon a vast superstructure in standard political economic treatises. All deductions made from that error are invalidated, page 21. So he goes into a lot more examples. This whole chapter is about this. So beyond the original state of things, which is, man, like the Robin Crusoe example, let's now look at the case number 2, where the labor works for another person or with the capital of another. Laborer receives wages in kind in things his labor produces. Wages are drawn from the product of labor. It's on page 53. So let's read from Progress and Poverty, page 53, concerning gathering eggs and berries. And
if I hire a man to gather eggs, to pick berries, or to make shoes, paying him from the eggs, the berries, or the shoes that his labor secures, there can be no question that the source of the wages is the labor for which they are paid. Of this form of hiring is the sayer and dare stock tenancy treated of with such perspicuity by Sir Henry Maine in his early history of institutions, and which so clearly involved the relation of employer and employed as to render the acceptor of cattle the man or vassal of the capitalist who thus employed him.
That's good. Appreciate it, Catherine. So let's, so we got another one. Is that where this one takes over? It was on such terms?
It was on, right.
Okay, so he can read, unless somebody wants to grab the microphone.
It was on such terms as these that Jacob worked for Laban. And to this day, even in civilized countries, it is not an infrequent mode of employing labor. The farming of land on shares, which prevails to a considerable extent in the southern states of the Union and in California, the Mateer system of Europe, as well as the many cases in which superintendents, salesmen, etc., are paid by a percentage of profits. What are they but the employment of labor for wages which consist of part of its produce? Okay, that's good. So you can see him going into additional examples of that wages are not paid by accumulated capital, that it's from the labor itself. So in the next case, or the next step in this process that he's describing in complexity, is where the labor is paid in an equivalent of something else. For example, the cut of a whale. He mentions in the book that 3/100ths of the whale would go to the cabin boy, for example. Oil and bone, part of the produce of labor when it's brought to port. This is slide 24, and he mentions that on page 54. If the agreed upon division of the whale is converted to a market price, labor is paid in money, the equivalent of real wages, oil and bone. There's no advance of capital made there. In the next step, case 4, is the usual method of employing labor and paying wages. The company hires a man at the proper season to gather eggs. And we have another reading, harvesting eggs. Anybody wants to read that? And pay attention to the phrase that the fowl are tame.
So harvesting eggs. They might employ these men for a proportion of the eggs they gather, as is done in the whale fishery, and probably would do so if there were much uncertainty attending the business. But as the fowl are plentiful and tame, and about so many eggs can be gathered by so much labor, they find it is more convenient to pay their men fixed wages. The men go out and remain on the islands, gathering the eggs and bringing them to a landing, whence at intervals of a few days they are taken in a small vessel to San Francisco and sold. When the season is over, the men return and are paid their stipulated wages in coin. Does not this transaction amount to the same thing as if instead of being paid by coin, the stipulated wages were paid in an equivalent of the eggs gathered? Does not the coin represent the eggs by the side of which it was obtained? And are not these wages as much the product of the labor for the eggs would be in the possession of a man who gathered them for himself without the intervention of any employer.
Okay, thanks. We got, the next one is concerning harvesting seals. This is kind of interesting take on getting paid, because there was wealth in the seals that the original hunters didn't know about. If we have no volunteers, I guess I'll read it. To take another example which shows by reversion the identity of wages and money with wages in kind, in San Buenaventura lives a man who makes an excellent living by shooting for their oil and skins the common hair seals, which frequent the islands forming the Santa Barbara Channel. When on sealing expeditions, he takes 2 or 3 Chinamen along with him, whom at first he paid wholly in coin, but it seems that the Chinese highly value some of the organs of the seal, which they dry and pulverize for medicine, as well as the long hairs and the whiskers of the male seal, which when over a certain length they greatly esteem for some purpose that to outside barbarians is not very clear. And this man soon found that the Chinamen were very willing to take instead of money these parts of the seals killed, so that now in large part he pays them their wages in that fashion. So that was an interesting reading, because probably for years these parts of the seals were just thrown into the ocean or wasted, and there was a value that wasn't recognized. So Henry George says, slide 27, page 56, is not a fund created by the labor really the fund from which wages are paid? With fixed wages, the employer takes risks, but contingent wages are typically higher. But the maximum in admiralty law is freight is the mother of wages. But then Henry George says production is always the mother of wages. So this is the point he's trying to make. George dwells on this. Labor always precedes wages. It is an all important to an understanding of the more complicated phenomenon of wages. So, you see John Stuart Mill, for example, saying industry is limited by capital. And he's probably taking an aristocratic view. And I think that's what Henry George is tackling here. Payment of wages always implies the previous rendering of labor. Let's have students read back to back. There's reading here about cotton, iron, leather, clams, and baking. We have a volunteer. Starts with bring the question.
So, cotton, iron, leather. Bring the question to the test of facts. Take, for instance, an employing manufacturer who is engaged in turning raw material into finished products. Cotton into cloth, iron into hardware, leather into boots, or so on. As may be, and who pays his hands, as is generally the case, once a week. Make an exact inventory of his capital on Monday morning before the beginning of work, and it will consist of his buildings, machinery, raw material, money on hand, and finished products in stock. Suppose, for the sake of simplicity, that he neither buys nor sells during the week, and after work has stopped and he has paid his hands on Saturday night, take a new inventory of his capital. The item of money will be less, for it has been paid out in wages. There will be less raw material, less coal, etc. And a proper deduction must be made from the value of the buildings and machinery for the week's wear and tear.
Okay, somebody want to read about clams?
So wages, labor produce, class creating clams. But if he is doing a remunerative business, which must on the average be the case, the items of finished products will be so much greater as to compensate for all these deficiencies. and show, in summing up, an increase of capital. Manifestly, then, the value he paid his hands in wages was not drawn from his capital, or from anyone else's capital. It came not from capital, but from the value created by the labor itself. There was no more advance of capital than if he had hired his hands to dig clams, and paid them with a part of the clams they dug. Their wages were as truly the produce of their labor as were the wages of the primitive man, when long before the appropriation of land and accumulation of stock, he obtained an oyster by knocking it with a stone from the rocks.
Okay, thanks. We got a good one on banking. Any volunteers to read that?
Come on.
Bashara, you want to?
What?
Oh, yeah, just do the reading about banking. Starts with, as the laborer.
As the laborer who works for an employer does not get his wages until he has performed the work, his case is similar to that of the depositor in a bank, who cannot draw money out until he has put money in. And as by drawing out what he has previously put in, the bank depositor does not lessen the capital of the bank, neither can laborers, by receiving wages, lessen even temporarily either the capital of the employer or the aggregate capital of the community. Their wages no more come from capital than the checks of depositors or drawn against bank capital. It is true that laborers in receiving wages do not generally receive back wealth in the same form in which they have rendered it, any more than bank depositors receive back the identical coins or bank notes they have deposited. They receive it in an equivalent form, and as we are justified in saying that the depositor receives from the bank the money he paid in, so are we justified in saying that the laborer receives in wages the wealth he has rendered in labor.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the thing to keep in mind is that we're spending a lot of time making sure you understand it. It's kind of like somebody saying, okay, you read it 100 times now, do you understand it? Okay, then you come back another minute. You understand it? Yeah. So what he's doing is building a foundation, because we've got 9 more books after this book here, and he's making the case for what the science of political economy is all about. Something that's 140 years old, that needs to be implemented as George wrote it. It's a fantastic book, but the importance of this course is to understand what he wrote, because it was very well received, and immediately after writing it, he was viciously attacked because he was opening up the closets where all the bodies are buried, so to speak. Also, in this example, you might remember in the first class, I said in the same vein, if you all remember having a lemonade stand when you were a kid, maybe not, but I used to have one. Would you sell your lemons to somebody in order to pay wages to your sister? That's crazy. You keep the lemons because that's your capital. You make lemonade, and then you make a profit from the sale, and that's where the wages go to your sister. I mean, that's kind of a simple example, but it's sometimes it's useful to go to that level of simplicity. So this universal truth that we're talking about is obscured by the confounding of wealth with money, he says on page 61. So now let's turn to more complex examples. There's something about surface mining and exchanging. So Michael, you want to read about surface mining and exchanges? We're going to be getting into the California gold rush, gold dust and such.
Surface mining and exchanges, in the early days of California, as afterward in Australia, a placer miner who found in a riverbed or surface deposit the glittering particles the slow processes of nature had for ages been accumulating, picked up or washed out his wages. So too he called them, and actual money. For coin being the scarce, gold dust passed as currency by weight, and at the end of the day had his wages in money in a buckskin bag in his pocket. There can be no dispute as to whether these wages came from capital or not. They were manifestly the produce of his labor. Nor could there be any dispute when the holder of a specialty rich claim hired men to work for him and paid them often the identical money, which their labor had taken from gulch or bar.
Okay, it looks like we continue on to the next one, as coin became, and we're on slide 34 for people at home or watching the archive.
So slide 34, surface mining and exchanges. As coin became more abundant, its greater convenience in saving the trouble and loss of weighing assigned gold dust to the place of a commodity, and with coin obtained by the sale of the dust and their labor had procured, the employing miner paid off his hands. Where he had coin enough to do so, instead of selling his gold dust at the nearest store and paying a dealer's profit, he retained it until he got enough to take a trip or send by express to San Francisco, where at the mint he could have it turned into coin without charge. While thus accumulating gold dust, he was lessening his stock of coin just as the manufacturer, while accumulating a stock of goods lessens his stock of money. Yet no one would be obtuse enough to imagine that in this taking in gold dust and paying out coin, the miner was lessening his capital.
Okay, thanks for reading. So on slide 35, we're still on chapter 3. After the easy deposits are exhausted, at great expense was required to sink shafts, when the gold in the streams were collected. So they had to sink shafts, construct dams, tunnels, all requiring capital over periods of years. And you might say, surely this is where capital funds wages, but no. The employer receives value before he pays out value, exchanging capital of one form for another throughout every stage in the process of production. Creation of value is continuous, he goes into in pages 63, 64. Creation of value does not take place all at once. Now let's have a discussion of tunnel cutting. This is kind of if you can imagine the tunnel under the Hudson River between New Jersey and New York, you might want to read this example called Cutting Tunnels on page 69.
Cutting tunnels. If the workmen were paid in tunnel, which if convenient might easily be done by paying them in stock of the company, no capital for the payment of wages would be required. It is only when the undertakers wish to accumulate capital in the shape of a tunnel that they will need capital. To recur to our first illustration, the broker to whom I sell my silver cannot carry on his business without capital, but he does not need his capital because he makes any advance of capital to me when he receives my silver and hands me gold. He needs it because the nature of the business requires the keeping of a certain amount of capital on hand, in order that when a customer comes, he may be prepared to make the exchange the customer desires.
Okay, thanks. So slide 37, let's recapitulate, this chapter 3 that we just heard. The man who works for himself gets his wages in the things he produces, as he produces them, and exchanges its value into another form whenever he sells the produce. If he works for another for stipulated wages and money, he works under a contract of exchange. As he renders his labor, he gets wages at stated times and stated amounts. As he labors, he is advancing capital to the employer. The employer never advances capital to him. And then continued, whether the employer who receives this produce in exchange for the wages immediately re-exchanges it or keeps it a while, no more alters the character of the transaction than does the final disposition of the product made by the ultimate receiver, who may perhaps be in another quarter of the globe or at the end of a series of exchanges numbering hundreds. So that was chapter 3, and I think you heard many examples of the wages not coming from labor, but wages not coming from capital, but actually from labor. So, maintenance of labors. This is chapter 4, and we got one more chapter after this. We're making pretty good time. We've been here about half hour. I think we'll probably go on for another hour, and then we've got some articles I handed out. Kind of interestingly, there's 2 of them. There was a shipping container full of $100 million in current, bank notes for the country of Liberia, and it vanished. I guess they got political troubles in the African country. So I had my question. You can think about it. Was this loss of paper money a loss of capital, and what would be the example? We're not going to talk about it now, but I just wanted you to know. The other article I sent out it's called British Local Authorities Say Budget Crisis Looms. And it's an excellent example of, hey stupid, have you heard of Henry George? So we'll cover that at the end of this. I just wanted to give you a little preview. So book 1, chapter 4, the maintenance of laborers. So listen to the intellectual gutter talk, my terminology, of John Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, and there was an author named Millicent Fawcett. They're all talking about wages coming from capital. And it's kind of slick. And this is why Henry George is spending so much time on this, because if you don't think critically, you get sucked into the error, and then you're not going to be there later on in the book. So John Stuart Mill, have we forgotten that people are maintained not by the produce of present labor, but of past? Well, Henry George would say we are maintained by the present labor because we're putting wealth into the system, whether it's a product or a service. And then Ricardo says, population regulates itself by the funds which are to employ it, always increases or diminishes with the increase or diminution of capital. Thereby, he's conflating the ideas of the wages fund with the population theory, which we're going to be covering in the third. That population has something to do with why you're getting paid a certain wage. Totally against what Henry George is getting at. And then Millicent Fawcett, a lesser-known author, says laborers cannot live upon that which their labor is assisting to produce, but are maintained by that wealth which their labor has previously produced, which wealth is capital. So it was very common to be confused about where wages come from, and Henry George is saying, you guys are all wrong, this is the way it is, and then he developed it in the rest of the book. These ideas are absurd, is what Henry George says, a confusion of thought on page 72, and we're on slide 41. That labor cannot be exerted until the products of labor are saved, putting the product before the producer. So that was the point he was trying to make. Now, I'd like to read this one because it's not Henry George from the Progress of Poverty. This is from the single tax movement in the United States, that book. It was written in 1916. I'm reading it because the New York Times editorial board took a stab at Henry George, and I wanted you to listen to this attempt at comedy. So, Henry George is getting popular. It's 1885. It's 6 years after Progress and Poverty has come out. Henry George has gone to Europe. He's gone back to California. He's back. It's 1 year before he runs for mayor of New York City. And this is what the New York Times says about Henry George and his ideas. The great project of the nationalization of trousers. He's jabbing. He's trying to make fun. So are ably urged by the eminent reformer, Mr. Jacob Isaacs, which is Henry George, cannot be lightly dismissed. It is Mr. Isaacs' opinion that trousers are the source of all wealth. This is demonstrated in 3 ways. No man can gain employment in civilized countries unless he wears trousers. We can all agree with that, I suppose. No man can, in the changing conditions of the climate of countries inhabited by civilized races, work without trousers and at the same time preserve his health. Hence, while wealth is the result of labor, is also the result of trousers. And then 3, wealth or money, which is representative and concrete expression, is universally carried in the pocket of trousers, the trousers pockets. So if you change trousers with land, you know, that's what Henry George was getting at, that the source of wealth is land value. But so my take on this, and I'm coming into the present day, you know how sometimes reporters will say, unconfirmed sources say, which it could be somebody pulled out of there. Is the New York Times really funded by subscriptions? Or maybe it's always been part of a deep state apparatus. So it's just speculation that maybe the New York Times is trying to criticize Henry George to throw his message off. And that was my editorial. So keeping on chapter 4, wages do not come from the wealth set apart for assistance of production, but wealth set apart for subsistence. Page 72, slide 44. Wealth is no longer capital, wealth used to procure more wealth. When articles of wealth pass into the hands of the consumer, so that's where the item goes from capital to wealth. For example, to the consumer for the gratification of desires, regardless of whether that consumption aids in production. So a product that somebody has in a store and they're selling it, it's capital until somebody buys it and carries out of the store. That's how the shop owner makes his money, using products on the shelf as capital. It is not safe to leave the argument here, even though it is sufficient. So this is another example on page 73 where he says, you know, I could leave it here, but let's keep on going. So must Robinson Crusoe create a stock of food before setting out to build a canoe? Of course he doesn't. He builds the canoe a little bit and goes out and hunts and fishes and makes his sustenance. On page 74 and 75, I started titling what these little statements, and maybe not direct quotes, but so he talks about community. In larger units of people, there develops a sense of mutual interest. This is the point I was trying to make at the beginning. He's talking about community, where people in the present exchange food with those whose efforts are directed to future recompense. Dynamics, we're getting into economic processes. There should be within the circle of exchange a contemporaneous production of sufficient subsistence for laborers and a willingness to exchange this subsistence for the thing on which labor is being bestowed. So, and then he has an example with the idle rich, the people who might have inherited government bonds, and so how do they get their sustenance? Well, bonds are nothing more than the power of commanding wealth, and not wealth in itself. They afford him a leisured lifestyle, has subsistence provided by contemporaneous production. So he can leave his house, stop doing what he's doing, buy the food, come back home. So just talking about there's contemporaneous things going on, that that work doesn't have to go to a certain point and then you stop and store up the wealth that you need. Infrastructure. When modern government undertakes great works of years, for example, building a tunnel, MTA fixing the tracks, those kind of things, it does not appropriate to it wealth already produced, but wealth yet to be produced, taken from producers in taxes as the work progresses. So this is how the economy works. And then again, he gets into community. The machinist's labor actually exerted in the production of an engine virtually produces the things in which he expends his wages. And then my little comment about what happens to the community when the machinist job moves to Mexico. So that's a little dig at NAFTA. Because it's important to understand that Henry George is talking about a domestic economy. It's very clear. He doesn't come out and say it, but when you're talking about capturing land value, it's local land value that you're capturing. It's not land value that's being shipped someplace. Land value always stays where it's being generated. So we got a reading. We got a couple more people that joined us. We're giving people an opportunity to read if you like. If not, Michael will read about the suspension of labor. And there's a good one, about 50 square miles of London.
So, suspension of labor. The 50 square miles of London undoubtedly contain more wealth than within the same space anywhere else exists. Yet, were productive labor in London absolutely to cease, within a few hours would begin to die like within a few hours.
People would
begin to die like rotten sheep, and within a few weeks, or at most a few months, hardly one would be left alive. For an entire suspension of productive labor would be a disaster more dreadful than ever yet befell a beleaguered city. It would not be a mere external wall, a circumvallation, but as tight as drew around Jerusalem, which would prevent the constant incoming of the supplies on which a great city lives. But it would be the drawing of a similar wall around each household. Imagine such a suspension of labor in any community, and you will see how true it is that mankind really live from hand to mouth, that it is the daily labor of the community that supplies the community with its daily bread.
Okay, so it's the interaction of laborers producing the sustenance that the workers are putting into products, into services and such. And then he gets into, probably, I think he's going to have more principles as the book goes on, but he says the first principle is the demand for consumption. The demand for consumption determines the direction in which labor will be expended in production. So, Michael, you want to read what he means by that?
Demand for consumption. The demand for consumption determines the direction in which labor will be expended in production. The principle is so simple and obvious that it needs no further illustration. Yet, in its light of all the complexities of our subject disappear, and we thus reach the same view of the real objects and rewards of labor and the intricacies of modern production that we gain by observing in the first beginnings of the society the simpler forms of production and exchange. We see that now, as then, each laborer is endeavoring to obtain by his exertions the satisfaction of his own desires.
Okay, then there's a continuation, next sheet. We see that.
We see that although the minute division of labor assigns to each producer the production of but a small part, or perhaps nothing at all, of the particular thing he labors to get, yet, in aiding in the production of what other producers want, he is directing other labor to the production of things he wants, in effect, producing them himself. And thus, if he makes jackknives and eat wheat, the wheat is really as much the produce of his labor as if he had grown it for himself and left wheat growers to make their own jackknives.
Okay, thanks. So on slide 50, mutual interest. Laborers in aiding in the production of what other producers want are directing other laborers to the production of the things that they want, in effect producing those things themselves. He says that on page 77. And then trade. This is my opinion. Do you see how misapprehension of George's view on trade devastates his main thesis on the circulation of wealth, subsistence, and wages? He describes this on page 78. Once again, George is focusing so much on the domestic economy and the dependence of workers in one part of the city or one region on workers nearby. The next reading is the immediate earnings of wages and subsistence. Michael, you want to, and so the man?
So immediate earnings of wages slash subsistence. And so the man who is following the plow, through the crop for which he is opening the ground, is not yet sown. And after being sown, will take months to arrive at maturity. He is yet, by the exertion of his labor in plowing, virtually producing the food he eats and wages he receives. For though plowing is but a part of the operation of producing a crop, it is a part, and is necessary a part, is harvesting. The doing of it is a step toward procuring a crop, which by the assurance which it gives of the future crop, sets free from the stock constantly held the subsistence and the wages of the plowman. This is not merely theoretically true, it is practically and literally true. At the proper time for plowing, let plowing cease.
And then I think it continues, would not the symptoms.
Immediate wages and subsistence. Would not the symptoms of scarcity at once manifest themselves without waiting for the time of the harvest? Let plowing cease, and would not the effect at once be felt in counting room, machine shop, and factory? Would not loom and spindle soon stand as idle as the plow? That this would be so, we see in the effect which immediately follows a bad season. And if this would be so, is not the man who plows really producing his subsistence and wages as much as though during the day or week his labor actually resulted in the thing for which his labor is exchanged?
Okay. So you see in some of those examples, he refers to biblical phrases. He's a very religious man. So let's talk about credit. This is an important point too about the economic process. Where labor, this is slide 53, page 79 of Progress and Poverty. Where labor is looking for employment, the want of capital does not prevent the owner of the land which promises a crop for which there is a demand from hiring it. The laborer or farmer himself may obtain credit, and thus the work done in cultivation is immediately utilized or exchanged as it is done. And then exchanges that unite production. Likened to a curved pipe, and this is the first of maybe 2 or 3 examples of a curved pipe that we'll get into in this book. Likened to a curved pipe filled with water, if poured in one end, a like quantity is released at the other. Not the same water, but an equivalent. Those who produce put in as they take out, receiving in subsistence and wages, but the produce of their labor. And now the last chapter, and then we'll open it up for questions and such. So this chapter is about real functions of capital. So we see a lot of talk about what capital is, what capital isn't. He makes a point that sometimes we get confused over what wealth is and what capital is. And so we're going to be reading about this. Slide 55, page 80 from the Progress and Poverty. If not for wages or support of labor during production, what are capital's functions? He asks. Capital increases when wealth is used to produce more wealth. That's probably the most common phrase that Henry George uses. He quotes Adam Smith in that example. Capital increases as wealth increases in the course of exchange. Capital increases the power of labor to produce wealth. Labor applies itself more effectively, for example, with tools, which are capital. Labor avails itself to reproductive forces in nature, living things. Permits division of labor, efficiencies, improved skills, less waste, taking advantage of diversities of soil, climate, and situations. Capital does not supply materials which labor works up into wealth. There's no such thing as natural capital. and we talked about this last week and it came up in other talk. The idea of human capital and natural capital, these are all what I call intellectual gutter talk because you're getting off message from what Henry George is trying to get at. That there's natural opportunities, which are land, and then you've got capital, a separate thing. Capital does not consist of materials partially worked up in the course of exchange. Capital does not supply or advance wages. Wages are part of the produce of labor obtained by the laborer. Oh, so you saw that I said that the capital does consist of materials partially worked up. So it's kind of like the idea of like a division of labor, or somebody works up something, then they send it to the next shop and they finish it up, or maybe then they add the painting or something. So that is capital as it's moving in that process. Capital does not supply or advance wages. Wages are part of the produce of labor obtained by the laborer. Capital does not maintain labor during progress of work. Capital does not limit industry, only limit being access to natural materials. So you might have a factory that's not efficient enough so it can't utilize the natural materials as efficiently or to a greater extent. So industry would be limited if you're not capitalized, let's say. Capital may limit the form and the productiveness of industry by limiting the use of tools and the division of labor. So the next one reading concerns infrastructure, and it's very timely and very relevant to New York City. Several readings here. So do the first one, Mark.
Infrastructure. That capital may limit the form of industry is clear. Without the factory, there could be no factory operatives. Without sewing machine, no machine sewing. Without the plow, no plowman. And without a great capital exchange and exchange, industry could not take the many special forms which are concerned with exchanges. It is also as clear that the want of tools must greatly limit the productiveness of industry. If the farmer must use the spade because he has not capital enough for a plow, the sickle instead of the reaping machine, the flail instead of the thresher, if the machinist must rely upon the chisel for cutting iron, the weaver on the hand loom, and so on, the productiveness of industry cannot be a type of what it is when aided by capital in the shape of the best tools now in use.
And then it continues on with, nor could the division.
So infrastructure continue here. Nor could the division of the labor go further than the very rudest and almost imperceptible beginnings, nor the exchanges, which make it possible to extend beyond the nearest neighbors, unless a portion of the things produced were constantly kept in stock or in transit. Even the pursuits of hunting, fishing, gathering nuts, and making weapons could not be specialized so that an individual could devote himself to anyone, unless some part of what was procured by each was reserved from immediate consumption, so that he who devoted himself to the procurement of things of one kind could obtain the others as he wanted them, and could make the good luck of one day's supply the shortcomings of the next.
Yeah. So you got one more. While to permit. While to
permit the minute subdivision of labor that is characteristic of and necessary to high civilization, a great amount of wealth of all description must be constantly kept in stock or in transit. To enable the resident of a civilized community to exchange his labor at auction with the labor of those around him and with the labor of men in the most remote parts of the globe, there must be stocks of goods in a warehouse, in stores, in the holds of ships, and in railway cars, just as to enable the denizen of a great city to draw at will a cupful of water. There must be thousands of millions of gallons stored in reservoirs and moving through miles of pipes.
Yeah, so you recognize New York City in that because they are busy getting the water supply for New York City. And that's up north, millions of gallons. So on the next page, we have labor needed before capital. Got 2 pages to read.
So labor before capital. But to say that capital may limit the form of industry or productiveness of industry is a very different thing from saying that capital limits industry. For the dictum of the current political economy that capital limits industry means not that capital limits the form of labor or the productiveness of labor, but that it limits the exertion of labor. This proposition derives its plausibility from the assumption that capital supplies labor with materials and maintenance, an assumption that we have seen to be unfounded, which is indeed transparently preposterous the moment it is remembered that capital is produced by labor, and hence that there must be labor before there can be capital.
And one more page, capital may limit.
Capital may limit the form of industry and the productiveness of industry, but this is not to say that there could be no industry without capital, any more than it is to say that without the power of loom, there could be no weaving. Without the sewing machine, no sewing, no cultivation without the plow, or that in a community of one, like that of Robinson Crusoe, there could be no labor because there could be no exchange.
Okay. Okay, it looks like we have another one. On the abuse of government and quickly reproduce capital.
As to say that capital may limit the form and productiveness of industry is a different thing from saying that capital does. But cases in which it can be truly said that the form of productiveness of the industry of a community is limited by its capital will, I think, appear upon examination to be more theoretical than real. It is evident that in such a country as Mexico or Tunis, the larger and more general use of capital would greatly change the forms of industry and enormously increase its productiveness. And it is often said of such countries that they need capital for the development of their resources. But is there not something back of this, a want which includes the want of capital? Is it not the rapacity and the abuses of government, the insecurity of property, the ignorance and prejudice of the people that prevent the accumulation and use of capital? Is not the real limitation in these things and not in the want of capital, which would not be used even if placed there?
And then the next sheet, we can, of course.
We can, of course, imagine a community in which the want of capital would be the only obstacle to an increased productiveness of labor. But it is only by imagining a conjunction of conditions that seldom, if ever, occurs, except by accident or as a passing phase. A community in which capital has been swept away by war, conflagration, or convulsion of nature, and possibly a community composed of civilized people just settled in a new land, seem to me to furnish the only examples. Yet how quickly the capital habitually used is reproduced in a community that has been swept by war has long been noticed, while the rapid production of the capital it can or is exposed to use is equally noticeable in the case of a new community.
Yeah, this reminds me of a slide that was in the first class where I questioned the use of GDP as a measure of economics, because a country that's devastated by war or tornado or hurricane, you got all this capital coming in to rebuild, so the GDP goes up. So somebody could ask, well, why don't we just have major fires and disasters every year so you have a high GDP? But it's a ridiculous thing. But when you think about what would be a good measure of an economy, you'd be looking at how good is the infrastructure, how much value is being created. See, and that would be a good measure of a good economy, is the unearned increment of land value being captured to fund the social adjustments, the infrastructure, the things that people and industries can use to improve their productivity. And that's a community point of view. So going back to, we're on slide 67, we're getting near the end, and we can open it up for questions and comments. Real limitation of capital may be its proper distribution. Page 84. Sparse populations often don't suffer from want of capital, but rather from the inability to profitably employ it. A bucket can only hold a bucket full. No greater amount of wealth will be used as capital than is required by the machinery of production and exchange. That best suit the people, page 86. And I thought this is a good example to have an illustration where he says in slide 68, page 86, the social organism secretes the necessary amount of capital just as the human organism in a healthy condition secretes the requisite fat. So you understand that fat is what you use to for fuel, for getting your, when you're in a running or physical activity. And he's describing this as an analogy for the production in a social organism. So a social organism, again, he's talking about community. It's not somebody figuring out how to jack up the rents and live somewhere in Connecticut or some other place, but a social organism within the community that we're here. And that's what Henry George is getting at. Wages are relatively the lowest where capital is most abundant. And this just illustrates what we just saw. The recapitulation of chapter 5. Wages do not depend on the ratio between the number of laborers and the amount of capital devoted to the employment of labor. Wages and interest do not rise and fall inversely, but conjointly. So this was coming up from the first class, where there was this idea that to determine how much wages you can pay, you look at how much do we have in capital and how many workers to pay out, and that's not the way of looking at what wages come from. We just went through all these examples that wages don't come from capital, and he giving examples of the situation where wages and interest, with interest being the return to capital, they rise and fall conjointly because you have this this bond between laborers and the use of capital, because that's when you're working and producing value, that's where it comes from. So as a prelude to class 3, which is going to happen in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the Malthusian theory, its genesis and support. Population naturally tends to increase faster than subsistence. This is what Malthus said. And George is going to thoroughly trash that. Inferences from facts. There's an interesting inference that you can make, and he talks about if you look at a dog in a certain way and its growth pattern, a 50-pound dog would have a tail a mile long, and it had to do with, well, how long is the tail at a certain age. And so he was having fun with that example. And when you get into the reading, you might look for that. And then inferences from analogy. Man is the only one of all living things who can give play to the reproductive forces. So even though life and nature will give you certain things, you see a waterfall, you put a dam and you generate electricity. There's nobody telling you not to do it. There may be some considerations, especially in the present day, where you might have an endangered species and you might want to be a little bit more careful. Then the last one is the disproof of the Malthusian theory. The power of producing wealth in any form is the power of producing subsistence. So that was, so we've been at it for about an hour and 15 minutes, so I thought that was pretty close to where we were yesterday. And I thought I'd open it up for questions, but then we can talk about those two articles. I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but I think what I'll do is open up for questions and pass around the mic if you got questions. So I think it was clear what Henry George went over and over and over, so that you can't be fooled if somebody came up to you and said, well, we can't do anything unless we get the capital. Well, I think we need the materials and the labor. That's what he says over and over. If there's if there's no questions, or if you want to think about a question, let's take this example of an article from the New York Times on Friday, September 21st. The title is "Vanished Cash in Liberia is a $100 million mystery." So the long and short of it is, Liberia is so poor, apparently, that they can't even print their own currency. So they have Sweden print the currency, paper money, I guess. So after they loaded all this $100 million worth of currency in a shipping container, it got lost. So the question is, the paper itself, was that capital? Anybody want to just start a discussion on it? Because I'm going to ask other questions.
Absolutely not. Yes, but.
Oh,
minimal
microphone,
amount.
microphone.
Yes, the paper was capital, but only in the sense for what the paper was actually worth as paper.
Okay.
Which is nothing.
Yeah, no, that was a good point. So there was, anybody else want to talk about how about if there was like banks loaning money to businesses that were for productive use, like creating wealth, and then maybe the currency might be involved in the transfer, to pay wages and such. Is there an example where that money that lost could be capital based on loans being issued based on that? Anybody want to speculate?
It's not really capital till it goes in action, where the work starts and then they start procuring things for it.
Yeah.
That can be, if all of a sudden, say they default on the loan, they can take those real goods. That's capital.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we can all remember back to the period in the 30s, or maybe it was the 20s, in Germany, where wheelbarrows full of money was needed for like bread and such. If you're not creating wealth, then the money itself is not going to represent anything. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that money is missing. I know that China is very active in Africa, and building railroads and doing things like that. So maybe after a while, maybe when other African countries succeed or fail, maybe there would be an example for that. So let me bring up this other one, and I suppose if we aren't generating any questions, we can, maybe I'll read this. This is from the New York Times. Let me see if I got a date. I don't have a date. It was recent. It's called "British Local Authorities Say Budget Crisis Looms." And I want people to pick out words or phrases that say, gee, maybe there's a Henry George solution here. So London, streets littered with potholes and garbage, alcohol and drug treatment centers shut down, vulnerable adults and children left without care. That is the grim picture of Britain's future painted by the County Councils Network, which warned on Thursday that local councils will be forced to slash more than $1 billion from their budget next year, in cuts that will very likely result and services being whittled to the bone. Councils are Britain's fundamental unit of government dealing with an array of basic needs: trash collection, public transport, libraries, town planning, caring for people in need, among other things. They levy a tax on homes and charge fees for some services. They also collect a nationally set tax on commercial real estate and keep an increasing share of it. So you heard the idea of infrastructure. So infrastructure is not being paid for. So is there a source of wealth if properly taxed or single taxed for doing this? Anybody want to maybe describe the Henry George solution for what we're reading here? That, you know, there's commercial real estate tax, but is it really focused on the land value that Henry George talks about so often? Okay, so here's another, I'll pick it up later in the article. There is not enough money today to run vital services. So is that a true statement, that there's not enough money today to run vital services?
What services?
This is people in Britain complaining about not having enough money, for example, to fix potholes, to put people in treatment centers. So is there enough money, or is it just not being collected?
Well, you know, right now, there's more money in the world than there's ever been. So it's not a question of not enough money, it's just a question of distribution and use.
Okay. Yeah, we're all reading about the distribution of wealth. That was Henry George's big thing, is that, and that's the whole thing with progress and poverty. Where you see progress, poverty comes along because wealth is not being distributed equally. So let me finish this up. Funding from London for local governments has fallen 60% since 2010, with reductions expected to total $21 billion by 2020, the Local Government Association has calculated. In response, nearly every council in Britain has cut or outsourced services, sold off assets, and tried to host of budget gimmicks. So here you are, you're a government, you own assets, and you're selling them to keep a treatment center open. So this is against the golden rule of government finance, which is something I know about, is that you don't borrow money and you don't sell assets for operational expense. It'd be like New York City going out and borrowing money at a certain percent so they can ship its garbage to Ohio or Virginia. It would make no sense to do that. You borrow money or you use assets to put into a productive enterprise to generate wealth, and that's how you fund government. So that was basically an example of what's going on in Britain. I think our British comrades in the Georgist movement have a golden opportunity to say, we've been at this for 140 years, here's what you should do. And it looks like there's going to be opportunities again and again and again, because they're trying all these things that failed. And we all know, well, there was this statement about insanity was the idea of doing things again and again with expecting different results. Somebody told me that how do you get to play at Carnegie Hall? You know, if you're a violinist, well, you practice and practice and practice. They were trying to refute the idea of the insanity is trying the same thing with and expecting different results. But I suppose if you practice playing the violin enough, maybe somebody will eventually let you play at Carnegie Hall. But anyway, that was my concluding remarks. So we're expecting to have a good class on October 10th. It appears that Steve Sklar will do his his effort to disprove the Malthusian theory, the whole idea that mankind's going to run out of food as he populates, but we all know that we're all here now. We got 8 billion in the world, or increasing, but we still find that there's places to live. I went on vacation to Michigan, and I drove from Ann Arbor to the northern part of the state, and there's plenty of room for people. It goes out mile and mile. So the whole idea about world being overpopulated is a falsehood, and it's very important in the Henry George's way of thinking and his proof of the remedy for progress and poverty that Malthus was wrong in that respect. So if there's no other questions, I guess what we'll do is wrap this up and invite everybody at home or watching this in an archive to watch for the class number 3. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for reading. We do have coffee, kind of late in the process.
Are you taking a break?
Yeah, we need to turn it off.
How are you?
Was there anything that was unclear, or is it kind of like going?
All right.